So we saw sine yesterday. Well, sine, remember, works very similarly to cosine. When we go to make the graph, we're still going to start by trying to think about these questions down at the bottom there about what's the midline and what's the amplitude. So the midline, remember, is always going to whatever number is added or subtracted on the end of my equation. And so in this case, it's -3. So if my midline is at -3, the very first thing I'm going to do is draw in a dashed line at -3. So go ahead and draw that in on your graph. And then after that, we look at what the amplitude is. Now, amplitude is always whatever number is multiplied out front of our sine or cosine. And so in this case, that's going to be 2. Now remember what amplitude means. Amplitude tells us that from my midline, I'm going to have to be going up 2, and I'm going to have to be going down 2 to get to the top and the bottom. It's just giving me those two distances. And so I draw on those two dotted lines now. So dashed line 2 up from the midline, and a dashed line 2 down from the midline there. Now, you'll notice that so far, as we've been talking about this, I haven't even talked about how it was sine instead of cosine. That's because sine and cosine both start the exact same way. They both start by drawing in the midline and drawing in the top and the bottom lines. So nothing changed in that regard when we were doing sine instead of cosine here. The only thing that changes is basically where do I put my first point. So, thinking back to that work that we did yesterday, where did we put our first point? Does it go at the top, the middle, or the bottom? Sine here starts in the middle. And so we're going to put our very first point here on the midline. So cosine starts at the top, sine starts in the middle. In case you're curious, no, tangent is not the same thing starting at the bottom. Tangent actually is a totally different looking graph. We aren't going to get into that right now. But sine and cosine between the two of them, yeah, cosine starts at the top, sine starts in the middle. Although, if I have my first point in the middle there, in the pattern that we've seen before, like for cosine, top, middle, bottom, middle, top, middle, bottom, middle, top. When we're at the middle, we can go either to the top or to the bottom from there, all depending on where we are in the pattern. So sine, we know it starts in the middle, but then where does it go from there? Is it heading up or is it heading down? It is actually heading up. So sine starts in the middle and then it goes to the top from there. So basically the pattern for sine starts middle top. That's where we are in the pattern. But it is otherwise the exact same pattern as we know for cosine. Top, middle, bottom, middle, top, middle, bottom, middle, top, middle, bottom, middle, top. It's the exact same pattern. It's just that this is the point in the pattern where I'm jumping into it. I'm jumping into it at the middle top. And so follow the pattern from there to go ahead and plot the rest of the points. And so this is where those points end up. Go ahead and check that you got each of those plotted in the right spots. Notice that it's still that same pattern. Middle, top, middle, bottom, middle, top, middle, bottom. Every time you jump between top and bottom, remember to pass through the middle. And then, of course, we draw the curve that goes through the graph from there. And so this is our final product. Now, you're doing these types of graphs in two different ways right now. Yesterday, you're doing them on the computer. Today, we're doing some on paper again. Some of you are probably starting to have a strong preference for one or the other. That tends to be the case. Some of you are going to prefer graphing on paper. Some of you are going to prefer doing it on computer, finding one easier than the other. Well, if you prefer doing it on paper, when it comes to doing the computer graphs, do it on paper. So, like when we have our test coming up, you'll be entering the graphs on the computer. If you want to first do the graph on your paper, like we just did this graph, do that. Do it on your paper. Draw the dotted lines in. And then when it goes to actually enter your answer, you just say, okay, now I just need to plug this in. And so like you would grab two of the points, depending on which tool you have selected in there, and you just plot those 2 points, grabbing them from your paper graph, and you'd have the one in the computer. So if that's giving you trouble, this is a great way around it. I just want you to have that as a tool so that you can use that just in case it's giving you any trouble. We never want like the tools that we're using to be our obstacles. We want those to help us. So let this help you. And so this is our new equation. Yes, you should be able to make this graph pretty easily, but there is something new and different in there, isn't it? This is not going to be cosine of 0. They changed the x, right? Well, mathematicians, as you have probably learned by now, they got a thing for the Greeks. And they like to use some Greek letters for certain variables. And angles, which is what we plug into cosine and sine, are amongst those. This is not a 0, it's actually a Greek letter. Specifically, that is the Greek letter theta. And so you'll notice then that when we see that symbol, it just means theta. It's probably worth making note of what that symbol looks like on your paper just so you remember what it means. Basically, it's just a 0 with a horizontal line through the middle there. And it's a Greek letter. It works just like any other variable. So it works like the x's do. It doesn't change how we do it or how we approach it. It's just a different variable that gets used when we start talking angles. The first thing I do in making this graph then is I still start by finding the midline. That's whatever number is added onto the end. So my midline is up there at 1. And then I look for my amplitude. My amplitude here is 3, which tells me that from my midline I'm going to be going up 3 and down 3 from the midline. And then once you have those 3 dashed lines in, then draw your normal cosine graph. Where does cosine start? Top, middle, or bottom?
No.
Cosine starts at the top. Yep, now we always have to ask that question. All right, so then our next graph. Again, kind of keeping us on our toes, seeing all these different combinations. With this one, though, how am I going to start? With my midline. I always start with the midline. In this case, it's at negative. So, we draw on the dashed line there at -1. Once we've drawn in our midline, we draw on our top and bottom. Remember, the top and bottom are determined by the amplitude, which in this case is 3. So from my midline, I'm going to go up 3, and I'm going to go down 3. All right, then once we've drawn in those lines, it's really just a matter of where do we start from? Where's our first point? Well, it's cosine. Does cosine start at the top, the middle, or the bottom? Oh, wait. This one isn't cosine. I didn't look carefully, did I? It's sine. Where does sine start then? Middle. And the middle in this case is going to be to the left 270. So my very first point is right there. Left 270 on my midline. Then from there, as I head to the right from 270, is it going up or is it going down? It goes up, yep. Because sine goes middle, top. And then once I know that, well, of course, you're just following the pattern from there. It goes middle, top, middle, bottom, middle, top, middle, bottom, middle, top, middle, bottom, etc. So as you take a look at this one and are working through it, we still start the same way. Still draw in your midline, draw in the top, draw in the bottom. Now, the big thing on this one, though, is noticing that when we start on the top line over to the right, 360, you'll notice that that first point is on the far right side of my graphing grid. Well, if that first point is on the far right side, we need to know where to go from there. And obviously, we can't put any more points to the right of it. And you know that if your first point's at the top, as you continue from there, it'd have to be then bottom on the right. Well, if we start at the top, it's also going down to the left as well. And so it goes top, middle, bottom, middle, top, and so on from there. So the next thing we need to do is we need to find our first point. Well, notice we got a plus 90 inside the parentheses. Plus 90 means left 90. So I'm going to put my first point over here at negative 90, but it's sine. Where does sine start? Top, middle, or bottom?
Middle.
Middle, absolutely. But it was negative sine. Well, the negative didn't change that first point, because if I'm in the middle and I flip it upside down, I'm still in the middle. So what is it going to change?
No.
It changes where we go from here. Normally we go middle, top. What this is going to do is it's going to tell us that we are instead going to go middle, then to the bottom. And of course, if you know those 2 points, you should be able to fill in all the others following the pattern, right?